Oh, hello, hello. Welcome back to another episode of the Parmjit and Pradeep show. My name is Pradeep Sangha, and we got Parmjit here. Parmjit, how are you?
I'm okay, Pradeep. What's up at your end?
Well, right before we were on going live here, I had to deal with my kids, and you and I were both talking about how crazy life can be sometimes.
Yeah, I think we are pretty much in the same boat today. We are both, I think I've spent significant time today doing something which probably end up yielding nothing. But that is, I think that's the way of life. So chaotic day, but uh, that's what life is.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Lots of work sometimes, but little to show for it. So I hear you. So
Especially
today,
spending time on phone talking to customer service.
oh yeah, exactly. And, don't get me started on that one. That's a whole other topic. We're gonna have to talk about that for sure. But today, you had something interesting you wanted to share. You want to talk about a study that you were taking a look at when it comes to modesty. So maybe you can share that with myself and the audience.
Yes, exactly. Means modesty, when you think in the South Asian context, means I pretty much grew up in that soup of modesty. Means we were drilled, uh, our parents, teachers, every elder in the community told not to show our feathers because it can invite jealousy, envy, and all sort of bad stuff. But I was actually reading something through a Harvard Business Review, and we talked about part of the study, a different study last in the last episode too. um, and the original study was published in the Journal of Social and Personality, Journal of Social and Personality Psychology, Journal of Personality and Social Psychology in
Mhm.
2021. So it's not very old. So just to be accurate about the description, and the study is that modesty can backfire. That's the title of the study, or the write up in the Harvard Business Review. And I started going through it because it intrigued me.
Mhm.
Being an Indian, whenever I think of modesty to me is like the old saying, uh, the silent water runs deep. To
Mhm.
me, that's a very illustrative of the depth when it can be in the terms of modesty. Of course, you can argue that modesty is false, and it can be false. It can be contrived, like false humility. But I'm talking about a modesty where the person who is successful is not, doesn't want to drum beat about it. So
Mhm.
this study is about that, and they the gist of the study. So I don't belabor the point here. The gist of the study is that in few experiments they did, ultimately it came to be that if you hide your successes from your peers and your coworkers and your partners, it it may harm your relationship. It may exact what we call the interpersonal cost. Uh,
Mhm.
and one of the very interesting thing which actually caught my eye was, uh, as that somebody who doesn't want to share their successes, they can be labeled as modest, but at the same time they can also be perceived as less competent.
Mhm.
So to me, that's interesting, because if you think from a cultural perspective, especially old Indian perspective, modesty, especially if it is not false modesty or false humility, it's actually considered as a competence, because usually the idea would be that you should not have to say that you're competent. Your work should shout from the rooftop that you're competent. Your work is your CV or resume. You should not have to print it and distribute to 100 people that I'm competent. So this is actually interesting cultural differences, the way this stuff can be perceived. And I often do wonder, and I do struggle with that part, that to what extent, or to at what level, especially Indians who may be middle aged, or who grew up in India, and grew up in that culture. You did not grow up in the culture where it was okay to flaunt your laurels. How do they feel about it, especially when they migrate to the cultures which are more okay with this kind of flaunting?
Mm. Yeah, that's a really interesting question. As you're talking here, I just quickly pulled up the definition of modesty because I always kind of overlap modesty and humbleness a little bit with each other. And so, the definition of modesty is the quality or state of being unassuming or moderate in the estimation of one's abilities, which is really interesting when we take a look at that definition. I'm going to share my perspective here quickly because coming, when I was in the corporate world, one of the things that I believed was a good thing was to be completely modest and completely humble. Based on my achievements, I actually did fairly well. I was one of the youngest executives in my role, for example. And I was very successful in my role, but I downplayed it and I thought that was a good thing. And I didn't know that it was actually harming me. I didn't know that it was actually limiting my career development. And especially when I came out into the business world, everything out in the real world, outside the, let's just say, the corporate world, in the entrepreneurial space, is almost the complete opposite. It's like you have to toot your horn and market all the good things about yourself and your business in order for you to get customers and clients and get ahead and actually look competent, because all your competitors are doing that. So if you're the one that's not actually doing that, then you're right. I think some people think that there's something wrong. And also, Parmjeet, on the other side, we do a lot of work with helping people with their confidence levels, with the drive, the confidence, their motivation. And one of the things is that we find challenging is a lot of people underestimate their own abilities. And I wonder if there's a tie-in with this whole concept of modesty, because if you're modest about your own abilities, I believe that's also a limiting factor, self-limiting belief, because you may not believe that you have a special skill or you're capable of doing more, perhaps, because you're limiting your own ability or the estimation of your own ability based on the definition of modesty in your own mind. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's interesting because I was thinking that in the perspective of not only modesty as a marker for performance or competence, but how does it will look like when we think of modesty as a leadership skill, you know?
Mhm,
And I can second and echo you exactly because I grew up in that culture. I still pretty much believe in that the value of modesty, but there's many times I it has costed me a lot of things
mhm,
because especially when people attach that ability to showcase your stuff as a kind of a metrics for competence, then the one who is modest is going to lose the battle.
mhm,
And I have personally, even here when I came here, it has taken me long time, and I think I still do that I would not show anything, I would
mhm,
not say anything. I would not post, for example, I don't post my stuff much on LinkedIn. In the terms that think the achievements, the things you get, not means I do post my videos and podcasts, but not other things like that you post that I got this certificate, I got that, or I got that. And I tend to think that has a negative side because especially in a culture where modesty is perceived as a kind of a or related to competence.
mhm,
um, so when you think about that, that becomes a liability. But then the even more important question in my mind is that uh, how does it impact does it how does it impact the individual, especially at a mental level, when somebody who is groomed in that kind of culture, and then I have to make a living in a culture which does exactly the opposite? Does it create a kind of a dissonance in their mind? Does it create a kind of what we call a kind of a discomfort?
mhm,
Do means people of color, do they lose out uh, on that kind of a ground because their belief is different than what other people believe? For example, if you look at the business world, most of the business world top CEOs are they belong to a very particular community.
mhm,
So also that means they also share the belief system. uh, they most likely have a similar belief system, if not completely same. And that will beg a question, that does it mean that the reason why there is not diversity at the top levels of executive leadership is because there's a dissonance between the way people perceive leaders and the way the current trend in leadership is. I'm not sure whether I'm making sense here.
No, I think you are, because I think there is a dissonance in terms of one's own thoughts on their abilities, and then being raised that way, and then being put into the real world and be like, okay, now you're looking for success. And if we come back to the South Asian community, for example, it's really interesting because, yeah, a lot of people have been taught to be humble or modest, for example, but then they always say, hey, look, mera pota doctor, right? Or it's an interesting uh let's just paradox, or dichotomy, to see that it's almost like talking out of both sides of your mouths, right? That one respect, we've been taught modesty, but on the other side, it's okay for other to flaunt your achievements, right? Which is a core concept of, for example, speakers. I do a lot of speaking events, and one of the things that uh, they do is they have a host that talks about all your credentials and all your successes before you come up on stage, so you don't look like you're bragging about yourself if you actually said the same stuff. When someone else says it, it's okay,
Yep.
right?
Mm.
But when you say it, it's not okay, because then people think you're bragging. I think there is a fine line there between um, sharing your accomplishments and your achievements. And here's how I distinguish it. Here's how high I had to get through this challenge in my own brain, because as I said, I came from the corporate world, and I was always grew up modest. My parents said, you know what, we're always look at the unfortunate people, what they have, never brag about what you have, what you've done, all this kind of stuff. And then coming into the business outside, in the entrepreneurial space, it was a different game, as I mentioned. And I had to resolve that in my own head. I had to get past that challenge. And here's how I got past it. Just because I talk about my own achievements, or just because I believe in my own achievements or credentials or whatever it means, doesn't mean I'm better than anybody else at the human being level. And I think that is essentially it. That's how I resolved it. Yes, I can compare myself to someone, another business advisor or a consultant or whatever, and say I have better skills, but I'm not better than that person as a human being. That's how I had to resolve it in my own head. And I think that enables me to get past that. So that's one of the tricks that I've used personally. I think it's challenging when we here's the other side see too. You've probably seen this. People who on the front will be modest, but on the back end, they'll end up cutting people down, or they'll say that they're better than other people. And I'm sure you've seen that as well.
It's that's what I think what we were talking about, the false humility or
Yeah.
the false modesty.
Hmm.
And I think going back to your point, the way you resolved your own dissonance, how to actually work with, so that because what you do is what you are not. So the distinction is doing and being.
Hmm.
Uh, Pardeep as a person is maybe same or maybe different than Pradeep who does something. So
Hmm.
doing and being, and I think that that brings up a very important observation: the value of modesty, and also going back to another point here, that a lot of Indian, South Asian Indians, I don't think they are they are modest in words, but in deed they are not. They are pretty loud and immodest.
Hmm.
Means look at Indian weddings, Punjabi weddings, and their houses and their cars, and absolutely modesty is the last thing on that scale.
Hmm.
Though if you talk to them, so this is where the dissonance is. Talk to them, they will still, I think, because they have been trained to talk like that, they would say that modesty has a value, but they are not modest. Most, I would say, are not modest
Hmm.
in their deeds, and it doesn't look like, because we don't have a verifiable evidence that people otherwise why would people um, do flaunt all these kind of things. Means I never in my 20 years here, I've never seen so many number plates with personalized
Hmm.
casts and all those things as it has seen in the past 5 6 years. Lambardar and this one and that one. uh, and it means there's nothing really wrong, but it's interesting if you look at it why people would do that,
Yeah.
and and modesty that excuse me, and then where does modesty actually stand in that context?
Mhm. Yeah, that's a really
Forgive me.
good. Yeah, no, that's a really good point there. So I think when it comes back to this article, this, I think just like everything else that we talk about, there's always two sides to the coin, or two edges to the sword. I think it's important. I think modesty is important. I think it's a core fundamental characteristic or a trait or value that I think enables us to, maybe not be so competitive in society. We are competitive anyways, but for maybe to people get along, to build relationships and so forth. But I think, yeah, you're right. On the other side, it can also be challenging as well. I think the false modesty is the bigger challenge for me personally, because I think if someone presents themselves in one way and they're totally open about their achievements, and they're sharing them, I think that's better than someone not sharing and on the back end, presenting themselves as better than someone else.
Yeah, because it creates two layers of problem. One layer for the listener and one layer for the person who is doing it. So if I am practicing false
Mhm,
modesty or false humility, I'm pretty much digging my own pit,
mhm,
because ultimately at the one point I am going to get married to my own belief system. So so I would rather pick somebody who's immodest but honest than a person who is falsely modest, because at least in one way you can be certain that okay, this is immodest person, and you can actually deal with that person that way.
mhm,
But if you are with a person who has two faces, it's become incredibly difficult to interact and form a
mhm,
good relationship, because that has to have some sort of a honesty in that. But coming back, circling back to our conversation, means the point I think we should leave our audience with is that if in this culture being modest is perceived as less competent, the question I would, and we both of us should invite our viewers and listeners to think about, is that how can you just be modest and continue to negotiate the culture you have, because you can't really change. If you want to do a corporate job and you suddenly find that in that context, if you are overly modest, you are going to get thrown out of the competition. It might be well worth visiting that how can I actually be competent and present myself to be competent without being
mhm,
immodest. That may be challenging, but I think it's a conversation worth starting, because I don't think it's about either and or.
mhm,
Modesty doesn't mean incompetence, and the reverse is not true. That immodesty also doesn't mean competence. But I think having our viewers think about this, that if they are modest and they feel this kind of a dissonance when they go for apply for jobs or on a corporate environment, and they should actually start asking themselves question, how can I actually bridge this gap without losing my core values? And I think once they can resolve that in their head, just like as you said, it will be worth the effort for them,
mhm,
because we live in this culture, and if this culture perceives modesty in that way, then I think the most smartest thing is to do start asking the question, how can I actually bring these together without losing one over the other, and vice versa.
mhm. And you bring something up, a really good point there. We may believe or perceive ourselves to be modest because we don't say things, because we don't verbalize it. But verbalization is just one form of communication. What are the other things that we're doing in our lives to get over the fact that we're not sharing our accomplishments? And Parm, you talked about that, the homes. Not that there's anything wrong with it, fancy cars and all that kind of stuff, but are you presenting a different message by your actions and the material goods, or maybe even a lifestyle? And not to say that there's anything wrong with a specific lifestyle. I encourage everybody to have a nice, lavish lifestyle if that's what they want. But if it doesn't fit, or if it's making you feel better about yourself, that's where I challenge people. right? If you have to live a certain lifestyle to feel better about yourself as a human being, if you have to have a certain vehicle to feel better about yourself because you feel like there's something else lacking in your life, that's something to address. And maybe that's a different episode, Parmjeet, because I think that that in itself is Pandora's box. So we can open that one up next time.
Yeah, exactly. I think it means just so that we are on the clear here. There's nothing really having bigger houses. Just to echo you,
Yeah.
and bigger cars. The point is, what purpose it serve in your life. If you're using it as a psychological or material crutch, then I think that requires us to ask a question: to what extent I'm willing to go this road, and is this the road which is going to satisfy me and in the end. So absolutely means there's we are not talking about good or bad stuff. We are just simply taking these examples we see. But again, I think if somebody is able to look at whatever they do and seriously inquire into it, that will lead to some kind of revelation uh, about what kind of person they are and what they want to be
Mhm.
and what kind of crutches they use. And we all use crutches, so I myself included. We all have to become aware of our own crutches, whatever
Mhm.
those they are.
Yep, I agree. Well put. Great way to close out the show. So I want to thank you, Parmjeet, for your time. I want to thank the for those of you out there watching this episode. Thank you very much. If you enjoyed it, please share, comment, subscribe to this channel because your support means the world to us. So thank you, and we will see you next time.
Thank you, Pradeep. Thank you, folks. See you next time.